to everyone who's joined the webinar. 30 to 60 seconds and then we will. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Jonathan Hemus. I'm the Managing Director of Insignia. We're a specialist crisis management consultancy. We work with leaders of businesses around the world to help them plan, train, rehearse, and sometimes handle the very worst days of their business lives. And of course, for the last few years, one of those worst days arrives when your organization is affected by a cyber incident. And we are running this as a repeat of a session that we actually ran 3 weeks ago in February, because it was so popular, both in terms of sign up and in terms of feedback. So this is a repeat exercise. I don't believe anyone who is on this call was on the previous session. If you were, if you loved it so much you want to hear it again, please stay on the webinar. Otherwise, the content will be the same as 3 weeks ago. And for those of you who are new, and I hope that's all of you, I trust that it will provide insightful, useful advice. We're going to look at 2 or 3 cases, take some learnings from those, also some recent research from Davos, share some tips and advice from our side as to how you can both be ready and some of the keys to responding effectively. And we'll be running a really short mini exercise towards the end of the session for you to put your own crisis management skills to the test via the polling functionality. Do please post questions as we go. There's a question pane within your control panel on your screen. We'll deal with questions at the end, but please post them as we go along, and we'll take as many of those as we can at the end of the session. We'll be with you for up to an hour. So let's take a look at what we've seen happening so far this year, because clearly there is no sign of cyber attacks abating. Here in the UK, there was a major incident affecting Royal Mail over the Christmas period, and in particular the early part of January, whereby because of a ransomware attack, Royal Mail had to tell people not to post items that were to be sent overseas. This was a situation which created significant operational impact, but also, as always in a cyber incident, reputational impact as well. And one of the challenges that all organizations face in a cyber crisis is successfully and appropriately dealing with the incident itself, whilst also communicating in such a way that reassures its stakeholders. And that's becoming ever more challenging. Clearly, we've seen over the last decade or more crises emerging on social media and people commenting on your crisis in real time as it evolves. One of the really interesting elements of this Royal Mail cyber incident was that the hackers leaked the conversations between them and the ransom negotiator at Royal Mail, and that was then published in full in national media. So this is a salutary warning that whatever you say internally, you have to expect that it may go external. So that just provides another challenge when you're already under severe pressure. So cyber incidents are not going away. As I mentioned, also at the end of January, there was new research which was revealed at Davos, the World Economic Forum, at the end of the month, and it was looking into the relationship and the attitudes of business leaders and senior technical or information security professionals within businesses. And these were some of the key findings. That report, by the way, it is available for download. So this is the 60-second summary of their key findings. The good news is that awareness of cyber risks at an executive level has gone up significantly over the last year. And in partnership with that, business leaders are more willing to address these risks. Not surprising, given that 43% of them think it likely that a cyber attack will materially affect their organization in the next 2 years. And per the Royal Mail attack and many other cyber incidents, their main concerns about the impact of the cyber attack are business disruption and reputational impact. So, to summarize those first 4 bullet points, from a business point of view, it is now recognized at a very senior level that cyber risks are real, that they can happen to us, and that they can do us serious damage, and therefore we as business leaders are willing to address these risks. And that is being in part addressed by the fact that 56%, so over half, of security leaders within businesses are now meeting with their board at least monthly. And again, that is higher than when they did the survey 12 months ago. However, there are still challenges to be overcome, and in particular, this one, that cyber leaders within businesses are struggling to clearly articulate the risk that cyber issues pose in a way that business leaders fully understand and can act on. So in other words, business leaders conceptually understand this growing risk, but they don't have a full handle on where it's coming from, its ramifications, and its broader implications for the business. And that makes it hard to gain traction. So how can we communicate the impact and the implications of cyber risk to leaders within our organizations? Well, wanted to share with you, as I mentioned, some cases, some examples, which maybe some of this evidence and some of these experiences can help to bring the reality, scope and scale of cyber incidents to life for leaders within businesses. So, if we look first of all at the Maersk cyber-attack, this is a very famous, well-known cyber-attack from 2017. The screen grab on this slide at the moment is a really detailed and fascinating story within Wired magazine about what happened in terms of this cyber-attack, the NotPetya attack, the story behind it, why it happened, how it happened, and how Maersk responded to it. In the follow-up email to this webinar, we will send you a link to that story. It is well worth a read. But just to give you some of the potted highlights, this was an attack which hit Maersk on June the 27th, 2017. It also hit many, many, many other organizations as well. Maersk was not the single intended target. They were collateral damage, and in fact they were infected by a single infection on a single Maersk computer in Ukraine. What was the impact? And this is really the key point that I want to emphasize against this slide, because this starts to bring home the sheer magnitude and breadth of impact of the cyber attack, and really just goes to show this is not just an IT issue. So because of the attack, everything, pretty much everything within Maersk shut down. So for example, their ports around the world were inaccessible to trucks delivering and picking up containers. Their offices were inaccessible because their access control was controlled by IT. Their phone systems wouldn't work. Their normal day-to-day office systems wouldn't work. Their operating systems for the cranes and the various machinery and kit at the ports didn't work. Their central booking system went down. They were without printers. They had no idea where any individual container was, or if you were at one of the ports, what was in any particular container at that port. Their cranes were frozen in suspended animation, and the normal means of communication within the organization and outside of it were unavailable too. The organization was paralyzed. And in the longer term, this was not a situation which was resolved within 24 hours. It was more than a week before the ports and terminals began to operate anywhere near normal. It was 2 weeks before staff began to be issued with new laptops. Can you imagine having to procure tens of thousands of new laptops? And it was 5 to 6 months before they were able to rebuild a fully functioning IT infrastructure to support the core business. And as I mentioned, this is just the impact on one of the businesses affected by the NotPetya attack. Maersk's CEO, Jim Snabe, at a speech said that it cost Maersk $300 million. Others have said that is a severe underestimate of its cost. And the White House assessment of the total damage to business was over $10 billion. And that's without even adding in or accounting for the impact on the global supply chain, not just Maersk itself, but all of the knock-on effects of those containers not moving where they were supposed to move at the time they were supposed to move. So I guess a couple of messages coming out of this. Maersk is not a traditional target for a cyber attack historically. You know, it used to be banks, financial services, online businesses, consumer-facing businesses. That has long passed. It is now all organizations, and indeed more operationally focused businesses are becoming more of a target because the cyber criminals recognize that if your business is based on a continually operating business, then once you're taken down, you are probably more willing to pay a ransom than someone who doesn't have an operationally focused business. So, an attack of this magnitude will change your business forever, and business leaders need to understand that and plan for it. And I'm talking about planning for it. I want to read you a quote from a professional pilot, Kim Green, from the magazine Real Business. And Kim Green said, "When it's just you and your craft at 5,000 feet, what matters most is experience, especially when the weather turns inclement or the engine goes quiet. You can be a whiz at aerodynamics and know your equipment like an engineer, but it's how you react when everything goes wrong that shows what kind of pilot you really are." Business leaders face down everything from PR headaches to financial crises and sometimes even threats to health and human life within their organizations. You can bring your A game to the boardroom and know your industry inside and out, but if you've never handled a major emergency, it's hard to know how well you'll fare when the first one hits. That's why pilots are trained in crisis management. We're taught to think through a range of potential mishaps, memorize checklists, and plot courses of action in advance. Executives can do the same. I would suggest that given the prevalence of cyber incidents right now, and that, as we saw in the earlier slide from Davos, that half of all business leaders believe that their organization will be subjected to a cyber attack in the next 2 years, it is incumbent upon us and them to plan for the worst case. Let me show you an example of what can happen if you are unprepared. Travelex, the online foreign exchange provider. If we again go back to 2019, Christmas 2019, New Year 2020, Travelex was hit by a ransomware attack, which, much like Maersk, but in a very different business, fundamentally brought the business to a grinding halt. Their website went down, their corporate website went down. You can see the screen on your PCs now. Their e-commerce platform went down, so you couldn't buy currency via that portal. The systems that linked them to the banks who also provided Travelex's services and the airports. They went down. Travelex was unable to do business. But despite that, and despite the fact that it was very visible that Travelex had a problem, they chose for the best part of 3 days to say nothing. And of course, what we know is that a crisis abhors a vacuum, and others filled that vacuum with comments from specialist journalists from publications like Computer Weekly, and of course lots of customers and other stakeholders posting to social media and elsewhere. And this is what happens if you fail to plan your response and to determine in advance how you will communicate. And I think in any crisis, communicating with your stakeholders is important, but what's of critical importance is communicating effectively with your own people, and that's particularly relevant in a cyber incident. And I want to read out to you some quotes from Travelex employees who were interviewed by the BBC in the absence of a spokesperson being put forward. They were all anonymous, but they were all Travelex employees. So the first one said, one source said his company's communication with employees and customers seemed to be a masterclass in what not to do. A second one said, I couldn't help but laugh at the suggestion that the public response has been shockingly bad. This is nothing compared to how it's been handled internally. It feels like there is a distinct lack of real leadership and communication. And a third one said, I work for Travelex and low down in the ranks, we have no clue what is happening. We are as frustrated and upset as the customers are. This is why it's so important to plan your communication in advance, and in particular, to keep your own people on board. They can be your biggest advocates, but they can also be your biggest critics. Try and make sure they end up in the former camp. The other interesting thing about Travelex is the ultimate impact of that cyber attack. I mentioned that this attack took place in the early days of 2020, over New Year. By August 2020, Travelex was filing for administration. 2,000 jobs were lost, and it required an £84 million cash injection to restart the business. And the administrators, PwC, said the impact of a cyber attack in December 2019 has acutely impacted the business. So that cyber attack played a significantly material part in the demise of Travelex before its subsequent rebirth. Conversely, let's take a look at a good example, an organisation which had planned its response. Norsk Hydro, which is an aluminium producer, one of the world's leading aluminium producers, so fitting into that category of operationally focused businesses, they too were hit by a cyber attack, and these messages first started appearing on computer screens at 4 o'clock in the morning European time. Soon as the first person spotted that this ransomware attack was underway, they called their boss, who in turn activated the crisis management team. And by 5 a.m. in the morning, the crisis management team was having their first meeting. And at that first meeting, they made two critical decisions. One, that they would not pay the ransom, and two, that they would communicate openly and transparently. Now, I just want to briefly pause there and reiterate the point. This was a team that was able to meet within 1 hour of the crisis breaking. Would you and your crisis team be able to get together at 5 a.m. in the morning? Do you have their contact details? Is there a standing place where they would meet? Norsk Hydro had thought about this beforehand and therefore were able to get the team activated and working very quickly. They were also very quickly in making decisions, but what drove those decisions was their values. So they had considered in advance the role that their values would play in determining critical decisions. Making those early decisions about not paying the ransom and communicating openly and transparently enabled them to save a lot of time around discussion and debate about those big decisions, and just enabled them to get on with it. With those decisions made, they went for this open, transparent approach to communication with gusto. So on day one, they issued 3 external statements. During the course of the crisis, they held a daily internal briefing. They also held daily media briefings. They used Facebook to do a lot of their communication because their website had been taken down. And they stuck to that promise of being transparent and open, to the extent that, unlike most organisations who try to keep journalists as far away from their crisis as possible, after a number of days, they actually welcomed the media in to look at the Herculean efforts that the Norsk Hydro team was making to recover the business and to look after their customers and their people. This is one of those great examples whereby, despite the fact that this caused disruption and despite the fact that it cost them significant amounts of money to respond to the situation, Norsk Hydro's reputation was protected, and not only that, its share price went up in the aftermath of the attack. And I don't think that would have been possible if they hadn't done their planning and preparation in advance. Some of you may have attended a previous webinar from last year in which Inga Kaur, the head of communications at Norsk Hydro, was very candid and again very open about what they experienced during that attack. And if this is a case that interests you, I would highly recommend you listening to that webinar. It's one of the most engaging and compelling webinars that we've ever done, and it does give you an insider's view of what it really feels like to be at the heart of a major cyber incident. So, preparing to respond to a cyber incident is critical. What does that mean? Well, it means assessing what the risks are. Where are you most vulnerable? Planning for it, working through the scenarios and double checking you've got the resources you need and that you have both a crisis management plan, but also checklists that relate specifically to a cyber incident. It means training so that the people required to be part of that response have been given the knowledge and skills and capabilities that they need to succeed under pressure. From the company spokesperson, we know it's very hard to communicate in the aftermath of a cyber crisis because you lack lots of the information that you would ideally like, through to the person who's responsible for logging the decisions and actions of the team. Every team member needs the skills and capabilities required. And then finally, exercise, rehearse your response. It's incredible how many learnings come out of doing simulations, exercises, and rehearsals. You don't want those learnings to only become apparent in a real situation. So I would strongly advise you to run desktop and full simulations to work through your response to a cyber incident and develop that muscle memory, which will serve you well as and when the worst occurs. Before moving on, I'm going to go back though to the planning phase. And I think one of the most obvious, simple, but most powerful things you can do is some scenario planning ahead of time. Some really fundamental questions, but if you can ask them and get answers to them, it will serve you really well should the incident occur. So in terms of crisis response, here are some of the questions you should be covering off as part of your scenario planning. Who should be on our crisis management team? What additional partners and expert advisors will we need in the event of a cyber incident? How would we operate as a crisis management team without the core systems that we're used to using? Where will we meet? How will we feed the team? Where will they sleep? In the Maersk situation, they brought a lot of people to a central location, and fundamentally, there weren't enough hotel rooms for all of the people that were working on their crisis response, to the extent that each hotel room was being used on a shift system. So 2 or 3 people would be sleeping in the same hotel room, but at different times of day. So these are really fundamental, but really important things that need to be thought about. How will we access the crisis management plan? In other words, if your crisis management plan, as it probably will be, is stored somewhere electronically, make sure that it's accessible somewhere else as well. What's your stance on paying ransom demands? What's your in principle position with regards to paying a ransom as a business? And we know in some jurisdictions it's actually illegal to pay a ransom. In other jurisdictions it isn't. And where it isn't, your leadership team needs to be thinking ahead of time, are there any circumstances in which we would pay a ransom? If the answer is no, no circumstances whatsoever, then that will make decision making much more swift in the event of a ransomware demand. If the answer is under certain circumstances, let's define what those circumstances are. And when do we engage the police or other law enforcement? In terms of the organisational impact, here are some questions you should be asking. What would happen if we didn't have any IT? What are our critical business processes? And it's about being ruthless in terms of prioritisation. Everything's critical, of course, but some things have to be identified as more critical than others. Much better to identify that ahead of time than during the crisis. Which are the most important? Which should be restored first? How would we bill our customers if our finance systems were down? How would we pay our own people? How would we access our buildings? And then starting to kind of move towards worst case scenario planning rather than the optimism bias that can sometimes prevail during a crisis. What's the impact if systems are down for more than a week? Let's not just assume we can get everything up and running in 24 hours. What manual workarounds can we deploy? Where can we get hundreds or thousands of clean laptops quickly? There are many other questions, but these are all going to serve you well should a crisis occur. And from a communication point of view, a really fundamental and again a very important question is, how do we want to be perceived? Determine that ahead of the crisis. What is your communication designed to achieve? And what's your approach to communication? You know, are you going to take the Norsk Hydro approach or the Travelex approach or somewhere in between the two? Have these conversations ahead of time. When must we brief the regulator? Who are they? How do we do that? Who else must we communicate with? Who are our priority stakeholders? How will we communicate with them? But what about if we don't have email? What about if our website is down? How will we communicate with them then? Who approves our communication materials? How quickly? Can we agree a slimmed down, speedier approval process than in business as usual? What are our in-principle messages in the event of a cyber incident? Who are our spokespeople? And what other communication resources will we need? I hope you get the picture. This scenario planning, simply through a series of structured but relevant questions, can help you be much better prepared and ready to act in a purposeful, considered manner when the worst occurs. We're half an hour into the webinar. I just remind you again that if you do have questions as we go through, please do post them to the question chat box and we will pick those up at the end. Okay, so I now want to move on to crisis response. Talked a lot now about what you can do to prepare, and I now want to look in the next 10 to 15 minutes as we start to get into our exercise. I want to look at some of the critical ways of working that, again, will serve you well during a cyber incident. And the first of these approaches is the setting of strategic intent. Now, what is strategic intent? Strategic intent is an articulation of, when we get to the end of this crisis, what do we want to have achieved? Where do we want to be? In other words, what does success look like? Defining that at a very senior strategic level, articulating it and sharing it amongst those involved in the crisis response can be incredibly helpful in guiding your decision making. With your strategic intent clear, when you are challenged with two alternative courses of action, you will then be able to choose whichever of those two courses of action is most likely to lead to your strategic intent. Likewise, when you have to prioritize, and by the way, crisis management is always about prioritization, you will never have as many resources or as much time as you would ideally like. Therefore, it's always about deciding what is the most important thing to do now and where am I going to deploy my scarce resource. Again, having defined a strategic intent, you can ask the question, right now, what area of focus is going to have the biggest influence in driving us towards our strategic intent? And because strategic intent is a long-term description of what success looks like at the end of the crisis, it is very unlikely to change during the crisis. What I'd also emphasize at this point is strategic intent is often, in fact, most often, not agreed at the beginning of a crisis. Because of the amount of adrenaline that's flowing when a team first meets to respond to a crisis, there's a real tendency to leap to action first before having decided what that action is designed to lead to. So if you're part of a crisis management team or advising or guiding them, I'd always watch out for whether people are acting without thinking, and if they are, having a quiet word with the crisis team leader and suggesting that agreeing the strategic intent would be a really helpful thing to do. I'm going to just have a sip of water as my throat begins to dry out, so excuse me a minute. I'm back. So we're now going to move into our mini exercise. Now I want to introduce you to a fictitious business called Orion. Orion, for the purposes of today, is one of the world's leading online retailers specializing in consumer electronics. It employs over 120,000 people globally and has over 100 million customers. It generates over $53 billion of revenue a year, and it's trusted and admired by its customers based on high levels of customer service and care. Its brand promise is our products to your door the same day, every day. It's in takeover talks with Amazon following a $26 billion offer. And its high-profile CEO, Anita Rani, is speaking at a global cybersecurity summit on Monday. Now, you are part of Orion's senior leadership team, and you have been briefed that there has been a data breach. The affected data includes customers' phone numbers, emails, addresses, and dates of birth, plus employees' home addresses. There is no evidence that customer financial data has been compromised, but it can't be ruled out. The hackers are demanding a ransom in return for not selling the information on the dark web. There is no external visibility of the attack at this stage, and of course, Orion's technical teams are investigating. So what I'm going to ask you to do now via the polling functionality is to choose your strategic intent. I'm forcing you into one of these 5 options. Catherine is going to open the poll any second, and then I would like you to vote for your preferred, your chosen strategic intent from these 5 options. So the poll is now open. Please all do express your view. No right and wrong answers. There may be some that are more right than others, but crisis management is a game of judgment. It's not a game of absolute right and wrongs. So thank you. I can see the first few votes coming through already. So I think we've got about 2/3 of the votes in. So for those who haven't yet cast your vote, we'll give you another 20 seconds or so that everyone has their say. So literally another 20 seconds. If you're still considering, please cast your vote now. Otherwise, in 5 seconds, we will close the poll. So Catherine will close that poll. And if we can show the results, please. So I believe that you should be seeing those poll results now. If you're not, please let me know, but I believe that you are. And as you can see, the most popular answer by just over half of participants was to retain the trust of our employees and customers. Second most popular was to communicate openly and transparently, with put customer interest first and minimize financial impact and minimize business disruption per our brand promise equal, with 13% each, and nobody voting for establish the scale and scope of the breach and its impact. So I'm going to cover off some of the answers which actually do not constitute a strategic intent. In other words, they don't fulfill the definition of a strategic intent, to help to make what does make a good strategic intent really clear. So everybody was right in not voting for establish the scale and scope of the breach and its impact. Do you remember I talked about strategic intent being a vision of success at the end of the crisis? Establish the scale and scope of the breach and its impact is very likely an early action, but it is not a strategic intent. Likewise, I'm sorry to say, those of you that voted B, to communicate openly and transparently, that is admirable, and that is very likely to end up with or contribute to a successful response. But it is not an end, it is a means to an end. So option B is about the way that you operate. It's a strategy, but it's not a strategic intent. For those of you who voted put customer interest first and minimize financial impact, just be aware that any strategic intent which has multiple elements has the potential to be less helpful than a single-minded one. So, for example, option C could cause you problems if a decision that you need to make will save the business money, but it might not be in the best interests of customers. Equally, a certain step, for example, compensating customers, would certainly put their interests first, but it wouldn't minimize financial impact. So beware of strategic intents which have multiple elements which may come into conflict with each other. If you end up in that situation and you can't quite crack it, the other option is to prioritize them. So when push comes to shove, which of those two elements of that strategic intent will you prioritize? And so that leaves us with the option that 53% of you went with: retain the trust of our employees and customers. That is a good strategic intent because it is an end. It is something that can help to shape decisions. If we want to retain the trust of our employees and customers, what should we do now? It will help you to make decisions and help you to prioritize. So good. Okay, we're going to move on. So I'm now going to move on to the concept of main effort. Again, a quick reminder, if you have questions, please post them now so that we can pick them up at the end. What is main effort? Well, main effort is defined as concentrating efforts on achieving objectives that lead to victory. In other words, they are the priority areas of focus at the current stage of the crisis. And because it's the priority area of focus right now, it will be prioritized for supports with resources. The main effort will get disproportionate resources. I mentioned this earlier, you won't have enough resource to do everything, so where are we going to focus that resource? A bit like strategic intent, it's also a harmonizing force. The entire group of people at all levels who are part of that crisis response team can focus on activities which will support the main effort. But because main effort focuses on what is most important right now, it will very likely change during the crisis. And this is one of the reasons why it's very important to take time out regularly throughout the crisis, lift your heads and say, what is the nature of the crisis now? And what does that mean in terms of what we should be prioritizing? Because there's a danger of sticking with your early priorities when maybe 3 hours or certainly 3 days later, the main focus and even the nature of the crisis itself has changed. So as I say, that's one of the key reasons why it's really important to take a step back and reevaluate regularly. So we move to our second poll, and I'm going to really force you into a corner here. I want you to select from these 5 options what your main effort at this early stage of the crisis would be. Is it establish how we were breached so we can fix vulnerabilities? Is it work with law enforcement to catch cyber criminals? Develop the stakeholder communication plan? Find workarounds to avoid disruptions to deliveries? Or decide whether to pay the ransom? So again, give you a minute or two to cast your votes. So about half of you have voted so far, just over half now. So we'll give everyone else another 30 seconds to express their view. And another 15 seconds. If you haven't voted yet, please do so. 5 seconds, and then we will close the poll. Last chance to cast your vote. Okay, so we'll close the poll now. So a broader spread of views there. So top of the list is developing our stakeholder communication plan with 35% of the vote. I think that is a absolutely appropriate main effort at this stage of the crisis, particularly if you have selected retaining the trust and confidence of your customers' employees as your strategic intent. We know that successful crisis resolution is a combination of addressing the actual problem and communicating effectively. So that would be an absolutely appropriate main effort, as would be the one that came second with 29%, establishing how we were breached so we can fix vulnerabilities. And that is the flip side of the coin to the communication bit. That is addressing the problem. So that is also an entirely appropriate main effort. Finding workarounds to avoid disruptions to deliveries. that would be particularly relevant if your strategic intent was to minimize business disruption. Absolutely, that's the one that you would go for. And then we have working with law enforcement to catch the cyber criminals, coming in at 12%. I would suggest that whilst that is admirable, main effort B, it probably shouldn't be the organization's top priority right now. I think there probably are more pressing and more relevant priorities right now. The police might disagree with you, but if you're thinking about what's best for your organization and its stakeholders, then that probably isn't going to be your top priority. And I'm, again, very pleased that no one voted for deciding whether to pay the ransom, primarily because, per my earlier comments, that really is something that you could have pre-prepared. And talking about pre-preparing things, if I just quickly refer back to strategic intent, you can, across all crisis types, actually have an in-principle strategic intent already defined. You don't need to wait for the crisis to happen to have that discussion. It comes back to that scenario planning. The more you can have thought these situations through in advance and have in-principle decisions made, the more effectively and the more quickly you will be able to exert influence over them. Talking of scenario planning, scenario planning is a really important thing to do during a crisis as well as before a crisis. So in this situation, in the midst of the cyber incident, it's a really good idea to lock away 2 or 3 people. We call them your most creative pessimists in a meeting room to consider, in a quiet environment, what could happen next in this situation. How could the situation get worse, deteriorate? What are the absolute worst case scenarios? So some real black hat thinking that they can bring back to the crisis management team to say, these are the things that we fear could happen next, that could make our challenge even bigger, or that could harm our business even more. And by doing that, that gives the crisis management team the opportunity to either take actions to reduce the chances of those negative things occurring, or to put in place contingencies to be deployed should they arise. And that's a process that should take place regularly throughout the crisis. So here we are, we're still facing the same situation. A brief reminder of what you're facing. I'm sure it's locked in your brains now. And I just wanted to ask you to think and then post to the chat section, what could happen next? How could this situation deteriorate? What are some of the worst case scenarios? So let's go for some audience participation time, please. Could you just briefly drop into the chat box some of the bad things that could happen over the coming hours and days following this attack? Give you a couple of minutes to do that. Okay, so we've got 3 or 4 coming in, so let me start to share those. Please keep posting them. So customers' financial information has been breached. Attackers release some customer information, details that could get us a fine from the ICO. The breach has been leaked to the media. Yes, remember we said earlier on that this was not public knowledge at this stage, but it could be leaked to the media. Suppliers refuse to work with you. Inability to communicate to stakeholders, you don't have their contact details. Yeah. the Amazon takeover is called off. Yeah, that could be one of the absolute worst case scenarios. Okay, so just in the interest of time, we'll move on from there. Thank you everyone who suggested their potential worst case scenarios. If I can just emphasize, this is another of those things that teams often forget to do in a crisis. They're so focused on reacting to what's happened that they don't think about taking the time to work out what might happen next. Again, it's not rocket science, but by doing this, you actually can preempt and be ready to respond to negative developments. And it's one of those things that gives the impression correctly that the organization is influencing the situation rather than simply reacting to it. So, final part of the scenario. It's now Friday, it's 2 days hence. Technical teams still working to identify and fix vulnerabilities. Normal business is still severely disrupted. As one of you predicted in the scenario planning, customer records have been offered for sale on the dark web, share price is down by 14%, and confidential and embarrassing internal corporate data has also been stolen. This includes emails relating to unethical behaviour of Orion employees, details of gagging clauses in terminations of employment, and sensitive information relating to the takeover. Again, someone mentioned the media. The media is having a field day. You are the main business story and indeed one of the biggest news stories of the week. And you may also recall that on Monday, so in 3 days' time, your CEO is due to speak at a global cyber conference. And we've got one final poll with just a yes or no answer. You're asked for your view. Should Anita Rani speak at the global cyber conference on Monday? Yes or no? We'll make this a quick fire one. So we'll literally give you 1 minute to cast your vote. So 15 seconds more. We've got nearly 3/4 of you having voted. If anyone else would like to express a view, 10 seconds. Excellent. Okay, and we'll close that one down. So, overwhelmingly, people have said yes. 94% saying yes, 6% saying no. This is one of the most bullish audiences to which I've asked that question. Never had 94% in favour. Certainly had it in the majority before, but not 94%. And what I'm taking out of that is by Anita Rani speaking at the conference, it gives her and the organisation a chance to influence the narrative, to share some of the learnings, to reassure the stakeholders who are still concerned. Those that voted no, and there's absolutely an argument for voting no, are probably thinking either that this is simply too risky, that the CEO could get ambushed, and or that she could get criticised for appearing at a conference when she should really be focusing on the problem at hand. I think what that also says is, there is no right or wrong answer when decision making in a crisis. Every decision that an organisation makes in a crisis will bring downsides. There's never an obviously right or 100% good decision. It's often a case of working out what is the least bad decision. So I'm now going to go into the final few concluding slides. If the idea of assessing your own preparedness to respond to a crisis is of interest, in the email that follows this presentation, we will send you a link to our free online scorecard. It covers all crises, not just cyber crises. You might find that an interesting exercise. More specifically, we will be sending you a link to a download of a one-page checklist as to how to prepare for a cyber crisis. And there is also the opportunity to put your name forward to go into the hat for one of 3 copies of my award-winning book, Crisis Proof. So if you have not yet read Crisis Proof, there'll be an opportunity to win one by responding to the post-webinar email. We have a few minutes for questions, and I've got a couple here. So do you recommend exercising leadership teams and tech teams together or separately? It's a good question, and I think it probably depends what stage of your exercising you're at. I think maybe in the early stages, exercising them separately might be a very good idea, but I think ultimately you want to get to the point at which they are being exercised together, because what's critically important is that both sides of that equation, the people who need to make the decisions and the people that need to implement the technical fixes, they need to understand each other, the implications of what they are doing and or requesting to be done. And so I think ultimately working together is a really good discipline. And I think what we're seeing a lot of is that there's quite a lot of technical testing going on, but that is only half of the story. And it is really important that the leadership teams, and this kind of comes back to the Davos research, that leadership teams rehearse their response to a crisis and understand what their technical teams are going to require, what is and what isn't possible, and also the requirement to make decisions, but not be on the backs of their technical colleagues kind of every minute of the crisis, because we know that will stop them getting on with the job. Second question, and probably the last one, given that we're nearly at the hour again, on a similar theme really, would you advise running a penetration test as part of an exercise? My view is that that is a viable thing to do, but what might be even more useful is maybe doing a penetration test ahead of an exercise for the senior leadership team, because the findings from the penetration test can be used to make the subsequent simulation for the leadership team even more realistic. I think sometimes if you're over-ambitious with the objectives for an exercise, you can kind of dilute all of them. So clearly penetration testing is really important. I think my instinct would be to say, do that first, get the learnings out of it, and then use that to add realism to the simulation that you run for the leadership team. So we are now hitting the hour. So thank you all very much for joining me today. If you have any questions that I wasn't able to answer during the course of the webinar, here are various ways of reaching me, and I'll very happily pick up with you subsequently if there's any, say, questions that you weren't able to ask. You will be receiving an email subsequent to this webinar with links to the resources that I talked about, and do email me if you'd like to go in the hat for a copy of the book. Once more, thank you for your active participation. I really appreciate it. I do hope that today has been useful and interesting for you. Do take the time to do the planning and preparation ahead of a crisis, and do remember the importance of setting strategic intent, determining your priorities or main effort, and scenario planning to enable you to deliver a purposeful and hopefully successful response, not just to a cyber incident, but any crisis. I wish you a pleasant and crisis-free afternoon, and look forward to seeing you on our next webinar. Thank you all very much.